Hello and welcome to the Erlanger branch of the Kenton County Public Library. My name is Mike Bloom. I work in the Public Relations and Development Department here at the library. I actually started for the library about 14 years ago in this very room. I was the adult event coordinator, and just looking at these tables and chairs makes me ache. So I'm glad I don't have to put them up at the end of the night. You guys notice the cameras in the back of the room. We have our partners from the TBNK here, and this is being broadcast live on Spectrum Cable Channel 200 and Cincinnati Bell Fiber Channel 819. So hopefully this doesn't turn into too much of a raucous group and we don't go viral with it. But you can also see the replays. We'll make sure we get it out on our Facebook channel and our YouTube channel. And you can see it on the TBNK airwaves as well. Their website is tbnk.org. So keep an eye out for that. It usually takes about a week or 10 days to turn around, but it'll be broadcast over and over again. You'll get a chance to see it. We'd like to thank the Erlanger and Elsmere Historical Societies for coming in and giving us this great presentation. The library takes its history very seriously. I know that we have all kinds of records. Not only here in Erlanger, but we have a local history and genealogy department down at our Covington branch. We've also produced historical videos like the 150th anniversary of the Roebling Bridge. We also have a history of the Ludlow Lagoon video out there, so you can see that on our website. You can also go to YouTube and search Kenton Library, click on videos, and you'll see all that good stuff on there. So keep an eye out for this program coming up. I'd like to introduce Paul Dusing. He is the president of the Erlanger Historical Society. We'd like to thank everyone for coming. They mentioned before, please silence your cell phones. If you need to go to the restrooms, they're right out these double doors to your left. If you go to the circulation desk, you've gone too far. Thanks again for tuning in, and thanks for coming and being part of a great crowd, and hopefully you enjoy the show. Here's Paul.
Thank you. This is a great crowd. Glad to see you. My name is Paul Dusing. Like he said, I'm current president of the Erlanger Historical Society. And on behalf of the Erlanger and the Elsmere Historical Societies, we're glad to see you all here tonight for our presentation on the Civil War in our community. Is there anybody here that was alive then? Tim, that's right. We have a gentleman in the back. We have a real Civil War soldier who will be available for questions after the presentation. That's Private Pieper. He has some wisdom to impart on equipment and uniforms and what have you. Members of the Historical Society will be presenting different aspects of life here during this period. For your viewing, we have actual Civil War military documents that were presented to the Historical Society just recently in the last 3 weeks or so. And you'll be able to view this document after we're finished. It is a discharged Civil War military discharge papers for a lady, Miss Sims, whose family this belonged to. Miss Carol Sims, along with some memorabilia in the back from our depot that we display on a regular basis. We're going to start the presentation. If you have questions, I think we have a few minutes at the end that we're going to dedicate to that. If you want to make a note, and we'll entertain your questions then. But if you think it's really important, you can ask the presenter at this time. Members of the Historical Society, like I said, are going to do the presentation in different pieces. And with that, we're going to start with Mrs. Pat Hahn, who will talk about the General Census of 1860.
Hi, everyone. Kenton County was established on January the 29th, 1840, from land given by Campbell County. It was named in honor of Simon Kenton, a pioneer of Kentucky. The land that was to become Erlanger was listed in Kenton County with a Florence post office address in the 1860 census. There were 53 families listed. 13 men owned most of the land in Erlanger then. Samuel Rice's land was worth $3,000, but his possessions were worth $15,000. Slaves were considered possessions. History tells us that we probably owned several slaves and rented many of his slaves out to other residents for an income. Some slaves were craftsmen and blacksmiths and seamstresses. Farmers would purchase those slaves and rent them out to other folks. Slavery was a very big business in 1860. An act to incorporate the town of Elsmere was passed February the 17th, 1860. Florence had a town marshal, a police judge, and a post office. So in 1860, the area of Erlanger, which had none of these, was listed in the census as Florence. The area was called Timberlake because Thornton Timberlake owned the largest amount of land in the area in 1860. Erlanger Post Office did not come into existence until the 1880s. The town of Erlanger was incorporated in 1897, and the first census that was Erlanger as the county of Kenton, state of Kentucky, was the 1900 census. In 1860, slaves were not listed on the general census. They had their own slave census, and that subject will be addressed later in the presentation. Just for a little background on the people of the 1860 census. As the Civil War approached, the area faced a situation not unlike that of all parts of Kentucky. As a border state, Kentucky had a faction that supported the Union, a large faction that supported the Confederacy, and some who wanted to remain neutral in the fight. The Erlanger area citizens were mostly Southern sympathizers. The Erlanger area was very rural and depended totally on an agricultural economy. Most of the landowners were from southern states with slaves and white farm laborers to work the land. Many laborers were from Ireland. These were probably indentured servants. This system seemed to benefit the servant well. Each indentured servant would have their fare across the Atlantic paid in full by their master. A contract was written that stipulated the length of service, which was typically 5 years. The servant would be supplied room and board while working in the master's fields. Upon completion of the contract, the servant would receive freedom dues, a prearranged termination bonus. This might include land, money, a gun, clothes, or food. It seemed like a terrific way for the poor to make their way to prosperity in a new land. Many of the farms were large and were organized in the southern plantation style, with large colonial residences typical of homes further south. A slide. These are the slides of occupations listed in the census for the city of Erlanger. And they were farmers, dairymen, printers, farm laborers, school teachers, carpenters, domestics, dentists, physicians, blacksmiths, merchants, machinists, and toll gate keepers. And the average weekly wages for 60 hours a week in those days was for the blacksmith, $10.68, and for the carpenter, $10.92, and for the machinist, $9.48, and a laborer would make $5.88. Slide. These are just a few photographs of the printing during the 1860s. They are the Harper's Weekly Magazine and a Valentine. Slide. Entertainment during the 1860s, with the Barnum and Bailey's Greatest Show on Earth was popular during the 1860s. Slide. And the Tom Thumb Wedding, most of you have heard of this, I'm sure, took place on February the 2nd, 1860, to another little person named Lavina Warren, and became front page news. The couple stood atop a grand piano at the reception to greet some 10,000 guests. Following the wedding, the couple was received by President Lincoln at the White House. Tom Thumb could sing, dance, mime, and impersonate famous people. He toured America. Slide. This is a photo of the winner of the Stewart's and Guffert horse racing cups in 1860. The American Stud Book was started in 1868, prompting the beginning of organized horse racing in the United States. There were 314 tracks operating in the United States. The first Kentucky Derby was not until 1875. Slide. February the 22nd, 1860, the first recorded baseball game was played in San Francisco between the San Francisco Eagles and the San Francisco Red Rovers. The Cincinnati Red Stockings of 1869 were baseball's first openly all-professional team with 10 salaried players. The Cincinnati Baseball Club formed in 1866 and fielded competitive teams in the National Association of Baseball Players. Slide. Theater was big in 1860. Our American Cousin Polka is best remembered as the play U.S. President Abraham Lincoln was attending in Ford's Theater when he was assassinated by actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth on April the 14th, 1865. Slide. The little girls of 1860 were playing with dolls and doll buggies, and a very expensive present would be a miniature diner set of French china. Slide. The boys played with glass marbles, hobby horses, and all kinds of miniature imitation of farm equipment used by the grown-ups. Slide. The U.S. dollar experienced an average inflation rate of 2.16% per year between 1860 and 1815. Or no, 2015, I'm sorry. $1 in the year 1860 would have been worth $27.28 in 2015. Before the Civil War, the only money issued by the United States was gold and silver coins. Only such coins were legal tender, that is, payment in that form had to be accepted. When President Abraham Lincoln assumed office, he understood the importance of money, especially for the war effort. With this in mind, Lincoln appointed Salmon P. Chase as Secretary of the Treasury. As Secretary, Chase alone was authorized to act on all matters pertaining to the Kentucky's finances. Slide. The Confederate States issued $1 just before the outbreak of the Civil War. The Confederate dollar, often called a grayback, was first issued into circulation in April 1861. After the war, it was worth nothing and caused many Southerners to lose everything. Slide. Greenbacks were paper currency issued in green on the back issued by the United States during the Civil War. They were in two forms: demand notes issued in 1861 and 1862. The Americans' first Social Security program, although Social Security did not arrive in America until 1935, there was one important persecutor that offered something we could recognize as Social Security program. No to one special segment of the American population. Following the Civil War, there were hundreds of thousands of widows and orphans and hundreds of thousands of disabled veterans. Immediately following the Civil War, a much higher proportion of the population was disabled or survivors of deceased breadwinners at any time in the American history. Slide. In 1862, the first $1 bill was issued as legal tender note by the U.S. with a portrait of Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury under President Abraham Lincoln. It was large size. In 1929, all currency was changed to its current size. The first $1 bill was issued as certificates under series of 1928. The Treasury seal and serial number were dark blue. And now I'll turn this over to Lisa Schumann to tell you about the 1860 slave census. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. To gain a better understanding of the numbers of slaves and slaveholders in the Erlanger area just prior to the Civil War, we will examine the 1860 slave schedules for Kenton County, District 1. Slave schedules were used in two of the U.S. federal censuses, 1850 and 1860. The purpose of the slave schedule was to count the slaves to allow southern states to be more equally represented in the House of Representatives. The term used to describe this was 3/5, and it meant that 5 slaves not allowed to vote equaled 3 white votes. Senators, on the other hand, were chosen 2 for each state, no matter the population. This slide shows a blank slave schedule for 1860. Both the 1850 and the 1860 slave schedules gave the name of the slaveholder, not the name of the slaves, the location by state, county, and district, the individual slave's age, sex, and color, and it was either listed as B for black or M for mulatto. It also noted if they were deaf, dumb, blind, idiotic, or insane, and if they were fugitives from the state or manumitted, that means given their freedom. Only the 1860 slave schedule, which we're going to be looking at, tells how many slave houses were on the property. Slide. By the way, I have copies of these. It might even be easier to see on the back table if you want to look at it more closely. District 1 of Kenton County included a wide area. Excluding Covington, it pretty much covered everything else from the southern border of Covington to the Grant and Pendleton County borders and between Boone and Campbell County borders. Page 1, which is what you're looking at in the slide, is identified as the Erlanger area because of the Erlanger names that are listed: Buckner, Stevenson, Timberlake, Graves, Yeager, Longmore, and Dolans, and Rust. And Rust is not really an Erlanger name. We know that he was living there at the time, but I'll have some other interesting details about him a little bit later. Kenton County as a whole reported 567 slaves and a population of 24,861 people. Listed on this page is Dr. John Stevenson, who was married to Alice Timberlake, the daughter of Thornton and Sophia. They owned 6 slaves and had 1 slave house. His mother-in-law, Sophia, was living in the same home. She owned 4 slaves and had 1 slave house. Sophia's sons William and Henry Clay Timberlake each owned 2 slaves, and William had 1 slave house. Milton Graves and his wife owned 8 slaves with 1 slave house. William Longmore has 1 slave. He lived on the Forest Lawn property. And then Franklin B. Rust was a slave catcher. Closer? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Thank you.
You're fine.
Thank you. Franklin B. Rust was a slave catcher who owned 5 slaves, but one of them, the only adult, was listed as fugitive. He actually escaped. And Sidney Dolans has 1 slave who is actually listed as manumitted, so given their freedom. Slide. This is a present-day map of the Erlanger area with push pins, and I hope you can see them okay. The push pins signify the yellow ones for the Graves family, the pink is for the Longmore, blue is the Timberlake Stevenson property, green is the Buckner home, orange is the French and Timberlake property, and red is the Stancever, Yeager, Hughes, and Bishop family, and they are at the end of Yeager Court, and that's because that's where the cemetery is, that most of them are buried. Unfortunately, I do not know where some of the others lived, like the Rust and the Dolans. Sidney Dolans is the daughter of, of William Dolans. Thornton Timberlake, we know, kept his horses on William Dolan's property, so we know that it has to be close to the Timberlake property. And Franklin B. Rust, as I said, was a slave catcher. He moved to Boone County after the Civil War. He is listed as being next to the Dolans. Slide. A total of 370 slaves are recorded in the entire District 1 area, with 80 of them in the Erlanger area. 66 slave houses were listed in the District 1 area, with 19 of those slave houses being in the Erlanger area. 2 slaves are fugitive, 1 belonging to Franklin B. Rust, as I said, and the other to a George W. Pickett. 1 slave is manumitted, and that was by Sidney Dolans. A total of 134 slaveholders were in District 1, and 25 of them in the Erlanger area. The largest slaveholders in District 1 were the Sayers family with 34 slaves, Richard Collins family with 20, and then the Timberlake Stevenson family with 14. The next presenter is Betty Rosman, who is going to be telling you about the homes of the time period.
Thank you all for coming. During the 1860s, life usually evolved around the homes that were here. Weddings, birthdays, baptisms, or just socializing. A house was the first priority to settlement. These homes are typical of the area, and most were in the area to be later incorporated as Elsmere in 1896 and Erlanger in 1897. Slide. The first known house in Erlanger was built by Bartlett Graves, a very familiar name, as there are 2 streets bearing those names. You'll hear these names mentioned often anytime you're talking about Erlanger and Elsmere. Bartlett Graves was born in 1766 in Virginia. He moved to Newport, Kentucky in 1785. Legend has it that he blazed a trail from Newport to Erlanger with a hatchet. Quite a man. In 1807, he purchased a large tract of land for $2.50 an acre. They called it Walnut Grove because of the walnut trees on the property. The log house was located on what is now Commonwealth Avenue. Mrs. Sarah Benninger purchased the farm in 1865 and later donated a large portion to the Southern Railroad to help build the railroad and Erlanger Depot. Slide. This home was built to replace the log house of Bartlett Graves. It was built by his slaves out of bricks made by them on the property and was later destroyed by fire in 1895. Many of the homes in those areas were often destroyed by fire because that was their main source of heat and cooking and living. The log house, the property is now the location of an apartment complex on Commonwealth Avenue across from the Erlanger Baptist Church. Slide. This is typical of slave homes in the area. Some of the slaves lived in the owner's home. They took care of household chores and sometimes the children. Other slaves worked in the fields and lived in their own quarters. Slide. This is the Timberlake home, another familiar name around here. He named it Sugar Grove, and it's located on Stevenson Road and is still there. This home was built in 1826 and has been registered as a historical spot. There's a highway marker on the property on Stevenson Road. Slide. This is the Timberlake home. He named it Sugar Grove, and it was built, it's located on Stevenson Road. This home was built in I'm repeating myself, I'm sorry. In 1860, this home was occupied by his adult child, Alice Elizabeth, and her husband, Dr. John Stevenson, first doctor in this area. One of their grandsons served in the Civil War with Morgan's Raiders and was taken prisoner of war. Their youngest son lived at Sugar Grove his entire life. This home was partially destroyed by a tornado that went through this area in 1915. The second floor was torn off and the home was never completely restored. Slide. This is Mary Timberlake. She lived in Sugar Grove in 1860s. She was largely responsible for raising money to build a school for children in the area. It was built on the site of the current Dusing Brothers Ice House. School had been held in an old slave cabin in back of John Stevenson's home. Slide. This is the Benninger home. This home is thought to be the oldest house in Elsmere. It was located on Benninger Avenue and Main Street and was occupied by Dr. Benjamin Franklin Benninger in 1826. It was originally built of logs and later covered with wooden siding. Notice the fancy trimming on the eaves of the house? This home, however, is no longer standing. There's now apartment buildings there. Dr. Benninger was a surgeon physician, but gave up his practice because he was too kind-hearted to do surgery without benefit of anesthetic, which was not available at that time. Dr. Benninger died in 1871 in Canada, where he was seeking relief from respiratory problems. He was brought back here and buried in Florence Cemetery in Florence, Kentucky. Slide. Some of you may recognize this house as the old rectory of St. Henry Church. We do not have all the history on this house at this time, but we know it was occupied by a very busy person, Louis Morelli. He was once known as the Grand Poobah in Erlanger. He was police chief, president of Erlanger Building and Loan, town clerk, Erlanger Elsmere School Board treasurer, and president of Erlanger Improvement Association. The house was sold to St. Henry, where the priest took up residence until 1961, when they built a new rectory on Dixie Highway. Slide. The Buckner home. Thomas Buckner purchased 550 acres in 1831 from the Johnson-Wilkes Survey, which included property where Forest Lawn is now located. The property ran from present-day Summon Hills Golf and Country Club to Dixie Highway. This home was built in 1839 in Federal style. Known as Beechwood, since it was built in 1839, it has been the home of the former Cincinnati Reds vice president and assistant general manager Bob Miller and his wife Chris for 11 years. Surrounded by homes built on what was Buckner's 1,500-acre estate, it is located in Edgewood, Kentucky, just off Turkey Foot in the 12-tree subdivision. It is still there, and it was available for sale in 2014. Slide. This is a toll gate house. This toll gate was typical in the 1860s. There was a toll gate located at what is now 112 Erlanger Road. Another one was on Dixie Highway next to Dusing Brothers Ice House. The toll gates were usually at the gatekeeper's residence. Our next presenter is Faye Whaley on food and transportation.
During the Civil War years, there was a shortage of food at home and for the soldiers. And sometimes the soldiers ate the same things day after day. They received some food from home for a while, but then it even became scarce at home. And as the war continued, there was less and less food arriving for them. Families at home had to improvise. Slide. You've probably heard the term hardtacks. Some of us probably think we made some one time when we first started making biscuits. One story tells how the men in the trenches had wormy hardtack or ship's biscuit served to them for a time. And so they were told to keep their trenches clean, especially for health reasons. And they were told to, breaking open the biscuit and finding live worms in them, they would throw the pieces in the trenches instead of throwing them out. Well, a brigade officer of the day, seeing some of the scraps along the front, he walked out and he yelled at him and he says, "Throw that hardtack out of the trenches. Haven't you been told that often enough?" And one little injured soldier there, he said he had a reasonable explanation. "We've thrown it out 2 or 3 times, sir, but it crawls back in." The women had to take on all the chores at home if no men or boys were left there, and they had to improvise as their supplies were now running low too. And when the country was catapulted into depression following the war, cooks had to get creative with what few ingredients they had on hand. And some of the recipes they developed out of necessity still exist today. Slide. They ate a lot of soups and stews, but many residents were quite creative, and although most of the substitutes didn't survive until modern times, satisfied Southern appetites to some degree. And as I said, they ate a lot of soups and stews, and I have a few examples listed here on how they improvised with what they had. For coffee, they took okra seeds that were browned, dried sweet potatoes or carrots, roasted acorns, and berries. For tea, they used herbs, sumac berries, sassafras roots, raspberry, blackberry, huckleberry, and holly leaves. And for milk or cream, they would beat an egg white to a froth and then add a lump of butter and mix it real well. For sugar, they used their molasses, sorghum, dried ground figs, persimmons, and May apples. Flour, they used rice flour, cornmeal, and rye flour. Salt, now salt was usually really rationed, and it was used for curing meat and seasoning. And sometimes wood ashes or gunpowder could substitute for salt as a seasoning. The hardtacks that I mentioned earlier were made from flour, baking powder, salt, and water. and it was actually like a hard cracker. And I have a display of, a dish of them back there. You can't eat them now, they're just for display, because it got worms crawling out of them. Okay, now we'll go to the transportation.
Yeah.
Okay, first picture should be some blacksmiths at work, I don't know.
There we go.
Okay. Transportation during the Civil War still consisted of largely of infantry marches and horseback. Large equipment and supplies such as cannons and cooking gear were moved using horses and wagons. Blacksmiths had their job cut out for them. Slide. Ships and trains were also used during the Civil War. At this time, steam was used to power both ships and trains. Slide. You got the ships and trains. The steam engine and steamboat were used to move large numbers of troops and equipment long distances. The railroads played a major role in moving troops and weapons. The Union Corps of Engineers laid trace and built bridges for the military trains. Civilians used the same mode of traveling. They just didn't travel as much at that time because it wasn't safe. Slide.
You want that one?
No. I didn't see that one. Anyhow, I'm going to read to you about there was a newspaper article that was given to the Erlanger Historical Society by the Erlanger Women's Club that read, the date on it was September 1862. In that time, 22,000 volunteer soldiers have passed through on the way to Chickamauga. The ladies distributed great numbers of sandwiches, and flowers were scattered through the train in great profusion. And it says that they were camped about at 5 Mile House, which is now Barleycorns down on Dixie. The following letter was received by the ladies of Erlanger, who were providing food for the soldiers that were passing through in camp. And this is the letter as it was. Camp George H. Thomas, Chickamauga, Georgia. To the ladies of Erlanger, I wish to express my thanks, and also the thanks of Company C of the 2nd Regiment of Missouri Volunteers for the gracious way in which you received us as we passed through your town. Our company thinks there's no place like Kentucky except Missouri, and no ladies like Erlanger, Kentucky ladies except Missouri ladies. God bless them both. My mother was a Kentuckian, but lives in Missouri, and that makes her the best of them all. 3 cheers and a tiger for Kentucky and Kentucky ladies. I remain yours, thankfully, Arthur J. Morgan. And I might say, you know, at that time, Kentucky was considered a neutral state. And so that's all I have, and I'm going to introduce you to Michelle Rosman. She's going to enlighten you on clothing and designs during that time.
Hi. The clothing and outfit. Can you hear me if I don't use the microphone? I hope so. I'm going to try. The clothing and outfits worn by the female citizens during the Civil War era in the 1860s.
Let's turn this off.
Then we'll turn it off. Thank
There
you.
we go.
Much better. Thank you so much. Okay. The clothing and outfits worn by the female citizens of the Civil War era are really kind of hard to imagine in the modern age of tank tops and short shorts, you know, and flip-flops. They didn't quite get to that, okay? There were lots of specialized dresses involved, particularly for the women. They had every occasion dresses, daily house dresses, morning gowns, ball gowns, etc. Slide. This particular slide is a family slide. It's a working class family, laborers, and you see a range of the outfits that most of the people during that era wore. Some of the women have their Sunday best on with their bonnets. There's a morning dress, which, and that's M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, signifying that they were mourning the death of someone during the war. And most of the work dresses, the ever-present aprons. young men in uniform and in the very narrow tie and suits of the era, farm laborers in the high-waisted with waist suspenders, girl children in dresses, kind of mimicking the adults, and the other children in clothing like those of the other servants and laborers. Slide. Okay. Civil War Southern belles were best known for their hoops. Ladies' clothing and fashion featured the hoop skirt as at its greatest width during this era. Up north, and down south, it took 5 yards of fabric to make the hoop skirt. As the cloth supply from the northern mills was cut off to the south during the war, they began to make some smaller skirts, not evidenced by this particular image, mind you, to help save material and to help the war effort. Or perhaps they recycled curtains like they did in Gone with the Wind. I'm not real sure. Okay. Well, you know what? You wonder what's under those hoops? Layers and layers and layers, okay? Layer 1, drawers, as they called them, underpants, okay? They were cotton or linen and trimmed with lace. Then the chemise, a long undershirt, usually linen, and stockings held up with garters. That's what was next to the skin, okay? We're not finished yet, okay? Layer 2, corset or stays that were stiffened with whalebone, then a crinoline, hoop skirt, 1 or 2 petticoats, dark colors if you were traveling so they wouldn't get dirty, all right? And then layer 3, then came the petticoat bodice, just the top part, the corset cover, and the camisole over top all of that. Layer 4, then you get the bodice itself, the skirt, often held up with braces, similar to a belt, then the slippers, and this, depending upon whether they were going to be indoors or out, slippers were made of satin, velvet, and or when they're going to be inside, they may have been knit or crocheted, okay? Now they're ready to go out, okay? Outerwear. This is what they're going to be leaving the house. A shawl, jacket or mantle, gloves or mitts, button-up boots, a parasol, bonnet or hat, excuse me, bag or purse, handkerchief, fan, some made of sandalwood, and pocket watch. Whew, okay. Now, the fine ladies did not paint their faces, okay? However, she sometimes did carry smelling salts. And who wouldn't if you had all those clothes on, okay? For festive occasions, ladies usually carried a nosegay of flowers. Slide. This is an image of a female slave. Although torn and tattered, this woman wears the clothing of a working-class family laborer. She has the ever-present apron, and she too has a 2-layer petticoat and a bodice dress, bonnet, and shawl. Okay. Slide. During the 1860s, dresses became more ornamental, primarily because there was a limited amount of cloth available for new clothes, so they typically would ornament or enhance the outfits that they had. They used braiding, in particular, and other trim. Sleeve styles changed. This is one of the sleeve styles that they call it the bishop sleeve. They had false yokes, gored skirts, pleats, and or ruffles on everything, like this particular tucked dress, which I think is kind of freaky. But it would allow for lots of alterations, which was another reason that they did many of the types of tucking and bodice work that they implemented at that point in time. Slide. This is a young child's dress. As is common for most eras, until recently, what children wore in the 1860s varied depending upon their parents' social status. Traditionally, fabrics and colors were brighter and bolder in the South than in the North. As the war progressed, this quickly changed, because instead of new clothing, old clothing had to be mended, and there was much reliance on hand-me-downs. Little girls, like their mamas, also had underlayers. Poor things. They usually had a long smocked camisole underneath, drawers that were attached with stays, with just 2 stays with buttons at their waist, then a short petticoat. Now, how'd they go to the outhouse? Can you imagine toilet training? I mean, really? Whew. Although I don't have an image of this, little boys began wearing what were referred to as knickerbockers during the 1860s. The outfit would include a white shirt, long stockings, and short boots. They dressed much like their fathers, with shorter jackets and pants. They might also wear a cap instead of a hat. Slide. 6 and 86, knitting for the soldiers. I really liked this engraving because of I just thought it was charming. Having the bonnet, the aprons, the little boots, the shawl, and evidence of knitting for the soldiers. And both sides, both the Unions and the Confederates, did everything they could possibly do in terms of making clothing, both not only for themselves, but also for the soldiers. I think I like shorts and tank tops better. Thank you, and I'd like to introduce Ed Von Eye now, who's going to talk about the Civil War activities in the area.
I'm going to try this thing. I don't know how it'll work. My job tonight was to talk about the involvement in this area in the Civil War. I'd like to apologize first. If anybody's been to I also volunteer at the James Ramage Civil War Museum in Fort Wright. If anybody's been there, it's going to be redundant. I do have a prepared statement. It's a lot shorter than what I do down there. But it's the best I had going. Slide 1. The time period around August of 1862 is referred to as the Siege of Cincinnati. It never happened. In 1862, the city of Cincinnati was the 5th largest city in the U.S. The city was the center of a huge meatpacking industry, earning the nickname Porkopolis. The city also was home to a huge machine tool industry. Besides manufacturing machine tools, the city had many factories making everything from cannonballs to wagon wheels to steamboats. The third attraction for the Confederate Army was that whoever controlled Cincinnati controlled the traffic on the Ohio River. Also in 1862, the Confederate Army had begun to move north up through Kentucky and Tennessee. Confederate forces had already invaded Richmond and Lexington. The next logical target was Cincinnati. Slide 2. At this time, General Horatio Gouverneur Wright was the general of the Army of the Ohio, having replaced General Ormsby McKnight Mitchell, who had been transferred to a post in Tennessee. With all this in mind, the Union Army sent General Lew Wallace to the area with 22,000 troops to set up whatever defenses they deemed necessary to defend the area. General Wallace also forts and batteries on the hills of northern Kentucky, from Silver Grove in Campbell County to Bromley in Kenton County. General Wright also oversaw the building of a pontoon bridge across the Ohio River. The bridge was constructed by bringing coal barges down from the Licking River, anchoring them and covering them with planking. This bridge was laid alongside the piers of the suspension bridge. The piers had been built, but the bridge structure had been put on hold during the war. There was also a much smaller pontoon bridge laid across the Licking River near the present site of Holmes High School in the Wallace Woods area. Eventually, the closest our area ever came to using these fortifications was in September of 1862. At that time, General Confederate General Henry Heath marched up the Lexington Turnpike, what we call the Dixie Highway, with a force of 8,000 Confederate troops. They camped in the area around a stagecoach stop called the 5 Mile House, which we call Barleycorns, at the intersection of Turkeyfoot Road and Dixie Highway. General Wallace, with a combined force of 22,000 Union soldiers and 55,000 militiamen, had a total army of almost 80,000 men. Being outnumbered 10-1, after 4 days of scouting the area, the rebels left this region and went to Perryville in central Kentucky, where they were one of the first units to engage the Union Army in the Battle of Perryville. Ultimately, the rebels were defeated in this battle. For the most part, the war then moved east through Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Although John Hunt Morgan did raid through this area in 1863. The Confederate Army did not come back through Kentucky. Thus, these defenses were never tested. Slide 3. The best preserved remnant of these 27 forts and batteries is Hooper Battery, located on a hillside above Highland Avenue in Fort Wright, facing the Licking River. This site was so remote that the defensive wall, a cistern, and remnants of the ammunition magazine were left undisturbed from the end of the war in 1865 until 1941. In 1941, a house was built on the hill. It was purchased by Fern and Sheldon Storer as their residence. Wanting a more level front yard, they eventually had the defensive wall knocked over and the area filled in. In doing so, they buried and preserved the wall, cistern, and base of the magazine. This site is today an active archaeology site and has been excavated to reveal these structures. Mrs. Storer, passing away in 2002, was the last to live in the house. In her will, she bequeathed the property, including the house, to Northern Kentucky University with the stipulation that it be used to promote history or education. The property is too far from the NKU campus to be of much use to them, and they put it up for sale in 2004. Several people from the Barringer Crawford Museum, several officials from Fort Wright, and Dr. James Ramage, history professor from NKU, collaborated on finding a good use for the property. Eventually, the site was purchased by the city of Fort Wright. The city then built 2 shelters and a playground on the site and turned the house into a museum housing many artifacts and relics from the Civil War era. The museum is open every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from March until December, drawing many visitors from out of town and out of state, as well as local residents. Almost done. That site is, like I said, I was supposed to talk about the involvement, other than supplying men and material for the war effort, that was about as close as we came in this part of Kentucky to being involved in the war. I've got a little bit here and I don't have a whole lot of information. Another popular site around here is Snow's Pond. Snow's Pond is between Walton and Richwood, Kentucky. Another historical remembrance of the Civil War in our area can be found behind the historical marker located on US 25 in Walton, Kentucky. This is the location of Snow's Pond. In September of 1862, Confederate forces under the command of General John Hunt Morgan and Basil Duke, a native Northern Kentuckian, captured approximately 60 Union soldiers at this site and sent them to a Confederate prison camp in Lexington. Later, the rebels were routed from this area by troops from Fort Mitchell. Later reports from Union troops occupying this camp claimed that the water at this site was contaminated and undrinkable. It was thought that the rebels had thrown dead mules or horses into the pond. That's about everything I've got. We've got a reenactor here that I'm sure will impart some information if anybody's got questions. If any of the other presenters, anybody has questions for other presenters, you know, I'm sure we'll do our best to try to answer them. Yeah. Tim, can you want to come up, see if anybody's got questions, or?
Wants to add anything?
Okay. Okay, any questions?
Yes, yes.
Uh-oh.
I'm guessing it must have been very hot during that time, in August and September 1862. And about how many canteen-fulls of water might a soldier have gathered and drank during that time, in that hot weather?
Actually, that time, in that year, there was a drought in Kentucky, in northern Kentucky. I'm assuming that it was, watch out.
Careful.
You're getting wrapped up into work.
Go ahead.
So I imagine that they really didn't have any access to amount of water, and in fact, the soldiers were always told that cool water was bad for them, that it would hurt your stomach, to try and not use any water whatsoever, or as little as they could. In fact, there's a story, well, actually the water is what started the Battle of Perryville. There's the 20th Indiana Regiment was there, and they were surprised by some Confederates. They weren't armed. They had stacked their rifles, put them in that little stack and everything. So when they were attacked, they were pretty well messed up and everything. And eventually more Confederates got there, the Union formed up and all that. But there's a story, I can imagine it's as true as any. You can take it for what it is, but in almost any battle, there was an officer would come around and find a bunch of soldiers maybe under a tree. They were all kind of propped up against the tree, and he would yell at them, you know, what's wrong with you guys? Get up, get going. And basically they were dead from heat exhaustion. What I have on right now, I'm sweating like crazy. But it's a hat with no way of getting any kind of air circulation. And I don't have on the underwear that they wore. They wore long johns, heavy long johns, wool pants, a wool Dommett shirt. This is a shirt that I say I got from home. It's cotton because it's a lot cooler. And a jacket like this, wool jacket, along with all the equipment that you had to, which was basically this, your canteen, a haversack that you carried food in, and possibly a knapsack. What I saw in one of the photographs, what we call a horse collar. They had a rubber blanket, and what they found out, instead of carrying all the heavy stuff, they could take the rubber blanket, lay it out with the inside facing up, take all of their extra clothing, whatever you wanted to carry, roll it up in that, sling it over your shoulder and tie it at the ends. That's what they carried, because the other stuff was just too much. I mean, they were forced marched 20 miles to 30 miles in a day. You march 45 minutes, quit for 15, 45 more minutes, quit 15, and on. And a lot of times they did this in the evening and night because of the coolness. But if they were close to a battle, they had to get going. It was any time. And you can imagine how many people dropped out. How many guys just had to drop out and I'll catch up later or whatever. That's a lot about water. But actually they were encouraged not to use the water, and what water they did get were from lakes, streams, ponds. They didn't go to a tap and get it. It had to come from wherever. That's one of the big things I talk about is they always thought coffee was such a healthy drink. Well, it was, because in order to make coffee, you had to boil the water, which killed all the bacteria, germs, and things like that. The plain water was really bad. It caused quite a bit of dysentery, diseases, and whatever. Yes?
How did you feel about, you and your fellow soldiers, feel about the war, fighting in the war? Was it high,
For, I would imagine it was up and down. If you look and see, all these were volunteer infantries. I'm with a group that's called the 6th Ohio Volunteer Infantry from Cincinnati, originally from Cincinnati, approximately about 800 guys. They started in West Virginia, and then were eventually, the first real big battle they got into was at Shiloh down in Tennessee. But on the way there, of course, they came down the river on boats. They were supposedly allowed to stop at Cincinnati for a little R&R. Didn't happen. As soon as they got to Cincinnati, the boats continued on down the river. They stopped at Louisville, and to a man, everybody got off the boats, got on another boat, and went back to Cincinnati and took their R&R. I don't think that would happen in the Army now. But at the beginning, most of the soldiers had signed up for a 90-day, 3 months. The war was going to be over in 3 months. And in fact, a lot of people were hurrying to get into the Army so they could fight and be in this great victorious battles and everything and chase the Confederates. And I imagine Confederates were about the same. They were eager to get into the battle, get it over with, go home, and we'd be all happy and great. It didn't turn out that way. But they stuck with it. And that's what I'd sometimes sit there and wonder, why did these guys put up with this? I mean, they had the ability to just, and there were some that did. I know if you look at, they have an ancestor and you get their record, you'll most probably find that they went AWOL. But they went back home because they got a letter that said, we need you at home. But they came back. They came back. What brought them back? There had to have been something there. And I would imagine, to me, it was to save the Union. And same with Confederates. They were there for their states' rights. And of course, now with all the statues being torn down and all this other stuff, people were really forgetting the real causes and the root of why a lot of these people were there. I mean, slavery caused the war, but it was fought for states' rights and for the Union.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much, Tim. Private Jim Peeper. Okay, I'll wrap this up. So, with the Emancipation Proclamation, the aim of the war changed to include freeing the slaves in addition to preserving the Union, just like Tim said. And doing some research, Emancipation Proclamation was actually an executive order, not executive order number 95, signed by President Lincoln, January 1st of 1863. Although the proclamation initially freed only the slaves in the rebellious states, by the end of the war, the proclamation had influenced the prepared citizens to advocate and accept abolition for all slaves in both the North and the South. Slaves that were sent to serve and fight for their owners may have returned home only to be told they were still slaves. Kentucky was considered a non-rebellious state or neutral during the war. Thus, slaves were not freed. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States, was passed on December 6, 1865, and the rest is history. All right, so we would like to thank Ms. Carol Sims for the military documents, which you can take a look at before you leave, and Mr. Tim Pieper, our reenactor, Mr. Steve Conrad from Boone County Historical Society for videotaping, and the Kenton County Library, where we are this evening, and the professional photographers as well. Thank you for what you do. Do you have any questions? No? Thank you very much for coming. We're happy for you.